now have Irina here from ArcelorMittal and also James from Microsoft. As a very quick introduction, my name is Harry Vickers. Mark Dooley mentioned me earlier as being responsible for working with global corporates on the PPA side of things, so working with our portfolio companies, working with now over 400 global corporates to understand what they need in terms of renewable energy solutions, decarbonisation solutions, and then really to have the real pleasure and privilege and in many ways sort of honour of being able to say, okay, well, this is great because across the Macquarie family, we've got quite a few of these solutions. And when we don't, then I have that wonderful job of being able to say, come on, Macquarie, let's work a bit harder and try and find some good solutions for these. So what we've got today is we're going to be doing a little panel, just 30 minutes of your time to run through how ArcelorMittal and Microsoft have been approaching really the opportunity of accelerating decarbonisation through climate innovation and also, importantly, through partnership. As I said, we have the pleasure of working with a good number of global corporates, but it's a real treat to be able to call some of those real partners and friends. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to take on the job, if you don't mind, of doing a little sort of introduction to yourselves. Please correct me. Please put your hand up if I'm doing something which is wrong. And if there's anything you'd like to add, then, of course, there'll be the opportunity to do that. Irina, Vice President for M&A at ArcelorMittal, and also, really interestingly, head of the XCarb Innovation Fund. I'm told you've been there for sort of 19 years. You've been at Microsoft for 19 years. Perhaps you both went out of university at the same time into those organizations. I'm not too sure. Obviously, ArcelorMittal, the world's leading steel company, and you've got the responsibility for strategic M&A deals, but also, as I say, this really important and fascinating move on the XCarb Innovation Fund. There's a couple of things which I want to pick out, and I think one of those in particular is how you're on the board of a number of high-impact innovation companies, and also the role that you play on the Leadership Council for Breakthrough Energy Catalyst. Obviously something quite close to your heart as well, James. James, 19 years at Microsoft, all number of different roles, but for the last few years, with a real focus on the portfolio management at Microsoft's Climate Innovation Fund, which is looking at enabling climate tech solutions, and that's stretching across a wide range of things. And so really looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts on that. So, more than enough from me, let's face it. I would love to, recognizing how you guys have looked at the energy transition, how you are very key players in that, but how you've actually sort of stepped in as enablers for the driving of that opportunity. Let's start on a really optimistic note. And Irina, I'll start with you. What developments or breakthroughs in the sector are you most excited about right now?
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Harry, for such a generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm very pleased to talk about the industry that I'm very passionate about. I think before answering your question, maybe just to set the scene and speak a little bit about steel. And I think most of you know that, we use steel pretty much every day. And it's in everything, it's in the cars, it's in the buildings, and, most of the infrastructure. And steel is actually great material, and I can talk a lot about the credentials of steel. It's infinitely recyclable, it's really versatile, and there is close to 2 billion tons of steel produced globally per year, and this number is set to grow given the infrastructure developments, given the energy transition, because when we speak about energy transition, all of those trends that have been mentioned in the last couple of hours require a lot of steel. If you talk about electrical vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels, nuclear power, low carbon infrastructure and buildings, just anything. So if you take all of those trends, and even data centers, and of course AI is a hot subject. So this number of 2 billion is set to grow to anywhere, and I think Emma probably would know the number because BNF does a lot of forecasts on this, but anyway between 2.3 to 2.5 billion tons of steel per year by 2050. So with such a great credentials, what is the challenge? The challenge, and I think you've also seen in one of the previous graphs, is that most of the conventional steel is produced through the blast furnace pathway using metallurgical coal. And as a result, for every ton of steel produced, there is close to 2 tons of CO2 being emitted. And if you translate it into the global CO2 emissions, it's just below 10% of global CO2 emissions that come from the steel industry. So this is the challenge. But of course, we can also view it as an opportunity for us to really make an impact and decarbonize the industry, which is so fundamental for the energy transition. And this is what, to answer your question, the great news is there are technologies to produce steel in a most low carbon manner. I was speaking about the steel being infinitely recyclable. So if you recycle steel and use renewable energy, you can get pretty much to the lowest carbon footprint. And Emma, I think it was the lowest gray line on your graph. So it was one of the lowest costs for the low carbon steel that you can achieve currently. Secondly, we as a company also developing a pathway that we call innovative DRI. Innovative comes from the point that DRI already exists. DRI stands for direct reduced iron, and there are currently facilities using natural gas. The intention was to phase out natural gas and use hydrogen, but the challenge there is the availability of hydrogen infrastructure, because some of our facilities are already hydrogen ready, but it's really this infrastructure which is not really available, and of course the cost competitiveness is not there as well. And that's the reason we also develop what we call smart carbon. What do we mean by that? Is that we can use existing facilities, but really try to leverage CCUS, leverage biomass, biocoal. I can give a couple of examples, but to minimize the carbon footprint. And the example I will give is, for instance, in Belgium, we have a pilot plant where we use the technology of one of our portfolio companies called LanzaTech to capture the recycled waste gas from the blast furnace and using their technology produced by bioethanol. And before that, we take wood waste, and then through torrefaction, we produce biocoal, which we then feed into the blast furnace. So in that way, we start with waste and we produce something useful, something that can be used as a transportation fuel, and we reduce the CO2 emissions along the way. So examples like that is, the example of smart carbon. And finally, well, not finally, but it's definitely one of the fundamental ways. We spoke a lot about electrification. So direct electrolysis presents an interesting pathway to produce steel in the most low carbon manner.
Fantastic. James, what are you most excited about?
Wow, I'm not sure if I can match that. Irina's excited about many things related to steel, which is
optimistic and excited.
No, it's awesome. It's awesome, and I think on our side, staying on the... Well, first of all, thank you for having us here, and very much appreciate the introduction. I think I'm trying not to mention 19 years and how long that is in Microsoft terms. Yeah. But, so I think one of the things that we are really excited about is around the materials innovation that we are seeing. So, for example, within our portfolio today, we've made about 63 investments since the fund was launched back in January 2020. A number of those investments are in materials-focused companies, so in batteries, in concrete, in steel. And within Microsoft, we have a really interesting research team, unsurprisingly called Microsoft Research, and they
welcome original.
Yeah. And I think where we have seen some incredible advancements in that kind of material science space is really in relation to looking at things like how do you find those new materials candidates that could perhaps provide a more sustainable, lower carbon material. And so, for example, they did a partnership with the Pacific Northwest Laboratory, very close to their headquarters, but they screened over, I think it was something like 32 million candidates to find a new style of electrolyte which was going to be more efficient than existing kind of lithium-ion batteries. And so if you think about that whole process, it's really screening that first 32 million, getting down to 500,000, then looking at the properties of those 500,000, trying to find that ideal electrolyte, and they found one. And so they then synthesized that candidate, and they were able to reduce the amount of lithium required in a battery by 70%. And so, of course, it's not kind of out in the market, otherwise I think there would have been quite a big press about that. But actually, they're still kind of testing that candidate to make sure it can live in the wild. But that materials candidate didn't exist before, so they found that, they created it. And I think that type of advancement in innovation is really exciting, and obviously it's accelerating R&D cycles, hopefully speeding up time to market. And so for me, that's exciting, but what's even more exciting is then thinking about how do we take that and then apply that to some of the materials-focused companies in our portfolio as well.
That's awesome. Thank you very much for that. Well, some big numbers to talk through there. One of the things, and I'm not going to be too negative, but one of the things in this space is obviously how you have really sort of attacked the opportunity of innovation and innovative technologies and companies. But what I'd like to understand a little bit is perhaps, and Irina, forgive me for going to you again, the key lessons that you've learned on the sort of the challenges that there are in bringing these technologies from that sort of that pilot stage, and you both talked about those sort of early pilot stage, to commercial scale. So what are some of the key challenges and ideally, hopefully, lessons that you've learned from that?
That's a great question, thank you. And I'll pick on the innovation and material science. For instance, one of the companies we invested is developing a technology in long duration energy storage, which is based not on lithium or cobalt or nickel or any of the other critical minerals, but it's actually based on iron ore, which is, one of the most abundant materials. And the logic there is, it can be low cost, long duration energy storage. And, those technologies, those solutions we need, again, we spoke earlier about intermittent nature of renewable energy and how do we get to this 24/7 energy, because our operations cannot run just only when the sun shines and the wind blows. We really need the base load. We need to ensure that we have the round-the-clock energy. And for that reason, we really need to have this long-duration energy storage solution. But speaking of challenges, I've seen through the rounds since we invested, some things that work in a lab, and now you really need to build it out. I think that's one of the massive challenges that I see, is how do you really deploy and how do you scale it up? And then most importantly, how do you integrate? Because, heavy industry like ours comes with a legacy, comes with the existing facility, existing footprint. How do you deploy some of those technologies? Quite often you need to retrofit, or you need to find a way to really connect or integrate. And that's what I've seen as one of the challenges in that deployment. And then, of course, also there is a challenge from the funding perspective, because, we are effectively building a new asset class. And some of those technologies, they get to the stage, they become too expensive for the traditional venture capital, but not de-risked enough for the traditional lenders. And then they get in this, this missing middle or value of death. And how do you really get them, to the scale they need? So how do you get them to FID? Because, they're in this situation. So that's one of the challenges that we are observing across the board.
Awesome. James, you're in a similar space, I guess.
Sure.
Seeing similar things or different? Or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I would certainly build on Irina's comments on the policy side and having the right kind of enabling conditions, because as CVCs, of course, you're looking for the right level of government policy and support to really look at, when you think about the new asset class, these first-of-a-kind facilities that are being built, and what is the supporting or enabling conditions around that, so that when you are investing, what are we seeing on that policy side to keep that, that technology and the support for that technology with a long-term supporting government policy framework behind it. I think I was really excited recently. You mentioned LanzaTech. We're investors in LanzaJet.
Through the Catalyst.
Yes, and then we had some really exciting news a couple of years ago, and it was kind of positioned in the news just recently. LanzaJet are part of the SAF facility, Project Speedbird, up in Teesside, and that leveraged the UK government's Advanced Aviation Fuels Fund. And those are the type of conditions where you think that's amazing. It's a brilliant partnership story with Novo Panagia and with British Airways. And so as an investor, those are the kind of enabling conditions then that, that we are seeing that's helping the portfolio to scale. It's LanzaJet's, I think, first plant outside of North America as well. So I think that's brilliant in terms of enabling sustainable aviation fuel production. I think the other bit, though, which sometimes maybe gets lost, is skills. And so there is a talent shortage for these new types of technologies. And in fact, this is probably shameless plug number one in terms of content that's available, but our LinkedIn team did a Green Skills report. I think they published the second version of it towards the back end of last year. And it really highlights the fact that demand is more than double the supply that's out there today, and that's on skilling alone, and that's in pretty much every area, from operations, construction, even the financing models that are needed for these new types of facilities as well. So I think that's sometimes overlooked, but it's still very important in terms of other factors.
Really interesting. And yeah, certainly something which we as a group have been very cognizant of and have had some involvement in that as well. Moving on a little bit. So as you're working to scale these decarbonisation technologies, so obviously it's very clear, as you said, that sort of long-term high-impact investments are key. Just one thing on the sort of the Microsoft front. So James, going to come to you. You've recently announced this shift away from sort of non-additive, unbundled, renewable energy certificates to a focus on projects that have a long-lasting impact on the clean energy transition. Obviously, innovation investment, it inherently comes with uncertainty. How do you at Microsoft, how do you maintain that focus and really that discipline to ensure that you're investing in high-impact projects that really do deliver that long-term value that's important?
Yeah, so I think that relates to what we call internally our invest to procure strategy. So we have a pretty hard mandate to make sure that every dollar of capital we deploy is linked specifically to procurement outcomes. So whether that's supporting our low carbon materials procurement or carbon removals, sustainable aviation fuels, as we touched on before, we really have to make sure that we are aligning to that mandate, because the procurement outcomes that we're focused on link to our 2030 sustainability commitments. And so that is crucial to how we kind of stay true to, I guess, our overall mandate. And of course, from an investment perspective, we have to stand behind the fact that we are investing in this company because it will help us meet our commitments because of these exact procurement outcomes that we're driving. And so we work very closely with the procurement teams within Microsoft across those areas I touched on and many more. And actually, you work with some of those guys as well in the energy procurement side. And so that's crucial for us in terms of how we govern the way that we deploy our capital.
Perfect, thank you. Irina, I'm going to ask the same question. So yes, just to go through it again, sort of innovation investment comes with that. A good degree of uncertainty. How do you at ArcelorMittal, how do you maintain focus and discipline to ensure that your investments are, to ensure you're investing in high impact projects that are delivering that long-term value?
Fantastic question, thank you. Well, first of all, I didn't talk about the funds. So in addition to the technology pathways that I've been mentioning earlier, we've launched X-Carb Innovation Fund to really support our journey to decarbonize steelmaking. And we're really trying to identify some of the most disruptive technologies, some of the most innovative breakthrough projects across the value chain. So that's just, because I was talking a lot about steel, but I didn't mention the fund specifically. And I think innovation, for me, it's an enabler of both sustainability and competitiveness. So it's not just about, of course, it's important to get to the net zero, but it's also how do you remain competitive, how do you remain future focused, because some things are fundamental. So for me, the answer to your question is, for instance, I'm a big fan of circularity. And what I see also in our industry, there are a lot of solutions that, regardless of policy, regardless of subsidies or trends or various developments globally, they're so fundamental. Something that we have not looked previously, and I think is still underexplored, but can really be further strengthened, is this cross-industry collaboration where, and I'll give you a couple of examples. We ran Accelerate a couple of years ago, and one of the technologies we identified was to use our waste slag, so the slag from steelmaking production, and through so technology was to process it into alternative cementitious material. And this is a fantastic example where you take a waste from one industry and you produce a feedstock for another one. And one of our last investments was a company that captures the waste industrial gas from blast furnace operation and produces two streams. One is a stream of pure hydrogen that we can re-inject back into the system, replacing natural gas, and another one is a concentrated CO2, which helps us leverage the economics of carbon capture. So, technologies like that, they're already economical, right? So if you look at them, and they're fundamental, you take waste, again, you produce something that is very useful. And, I also have a couple of examples where you can take waste heat and then convert it into the energy storage. So things like that, for me, regardless of the current economic business case for some of the new technologies where it's difficult to get to the bankable case, we must be investing in those.
Perfect, thank you. And I guess, perhaps in line with that, perhaps contradicting it a bit, overall, many of the emerging solutions which we see, they still do carry this green premium that we refer to. Now, I think one of the things that's really, well, let's face it, it's awesome on the ArcelorMittal front is how the low carbon steel solution in the market, you've doubled the sales of that through 23 and 24, which is, of course, is a hugely encouraging sign. What I'd like to understand, and Irina, I'll come to you on this, is are corporate buyers, are you seeing them genuinely willing to pay more for those sustainable materials, or overall, are you still viewing that cost associated as still being a barrier?
There are customers. We see the willingness to look at the green steel solutions. But imagine, the ton of steel produced through the blast furnace using metallurgical coal that resulted in a lot of CO2 emissions, and the ton of steel produced through direct electrolysis or any other clean way. They look exactly the same, So, the ton delivered to you is, you will never be able to identify, how this ton of steel was produced or whatever is the volume of steel. So the point I'm trying to make, for the customers to really be willing to pay this premium, there has to be, a better framework to incentivize them. We do see some demand, but realistically, if you look at majority of customers, quite often it's not even about willingness. They simply can't afford paying the premium because their own business model can only afford, let's say, margins of below $100 per ton. So how can you possibly impose a premium on them of a couple of hundred? So, let alone the willingness is just kind of the economic reality. So while, of course, I'm an optimistic person by nature, and, I would like to say, to make a statement that there is a lot of willingness to pay, but I think it's more that fundamentally we need to get to the point that your green solutions have to be priced equally or even better than your current solutions.
Yeah, certainly. James, I'm going to view you more as a sort of customer in that space. How do you at Microsoft evaluate that, let's face it, that trade-off that there is between cost and sustainability?
Yeah, so I think maybe we can share a relatively recent example, because we are in the process of building 2 data centers using what's regarded as super strong engineered wood. And so this process is really focused on looking at how we can reduce the embodied carbon of those data center builds. And so when we look at the way that the balance of now putting in this engineered wood combined with less concrete and steel is really reducing embodied carbon, I think I had it highlighted here actually, because I didn't want to lose the point, but it's effectively helping us to reduce the embodied carbon by 35% compared to conventional steel construction and 65% compared to typical precast concrete. And so when you think about that green premium and the offset of then cost versus meeting the sustainability commitments, obviously as an investor, we hope that by also being a buyer, we're hoping to, give the market demand signals. And of course, we're co-investors, and some of our co-investors are buyers as well. Sure. So those early market demand signals are hoping that they'll bring the green premium down. But at the same time, that's offset by some really significant embodied carbon savings on the future data center builds as well. And that is shameless plug number 2, in that if you want to read more about that, there is a blog post called Sustainable by Design, which is only a couple of months old. It came out middle of December, I think it was. But it goes into quite some detail around the solutions and the real impact that it's having on our overall sustainability commitments as well.
That's awesome. And even with it being a couple of months old, it's still very much, even though there's this fast race of change, it's still very relevant.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And please plug anything that you want during this.
I'm not done yet, by the way, sorry.
So, we've got a few minutes remaining. One of the things, obviously, we're sort of delighted that we consider you guys as partners through the work which we're doing as Macquarie, and then also through our portfolio companies. And part of this big challenge is how we do work better together. Obviously, Microsoft, you've been very public with partnerships with ADNOC and with Mazda, and then you've also got a fascinating partnership with ArcelorMittal, with Vestas, around developing low-carbon steel solutions for the wind industry. What I'd like to understand is, and please take either one or the other, what is the sort of the biggest opportunities which you see around partnerships, or perhaps the biggest challenges you see around partnerships? And of course, that can be with other people through the chain or even with competitors. So, Irina.
I'll pick the opportunities.
You're pretty good. Let's be positive about this. Brilliant.
Now, speaking about partnership, but I think that's the name of the panel as well, and that's what we were earlier discussing on the breakthrough energy catalyst. I think that's one of the good examples. Because, taking a step back, the challenge is massive, and, no one can do it alone. It's really about cross-industry collaboration, private-public partnership. And a good example of the partnership that we did with the Breakthrough Energy Catalyst is they're trying to address exactly the challenge that I was speaking earlier about. When technologies get into this valley of death, you have this emerging infrastructure, you have this emerging technologies, and Breakthrough Energy wants to support exactly those, like LanzaJet and some others, to get them to this necessary scale when they become commercially viable and scalable and commercially investable. So that's one of the good partnerships where you have Microsoft, you have some other companies across the value chain to really look at some of those technologies we need and the common infrastructure we need. Because, if you speak about some of the fundamental infrastructure, and I call it intelligent infrastructure as well, electrification, energy storage, data centers, and AI, imagine in 5-10 years how the world is going to look like. We need to build them out. It's it's a new asset class, but we need to build them out. It's absolutely fundamental, and it will happen. We can see the wheels are in motion. It's just more how do we do it in the most optimal, in the most pragmatic and optimal way to really get us in the most in the most efficient speed to the net zero picture.
Perfect. Thank you. And James, for you, on the partnerships angle.
Yeah, I think partnerships for us are key. And in fact, within our fund team, we actually focus on a few kind of strategic partnerships each year as well. And so a great example would be we did a materials-focused challenge that we finished just towards the end of November. And that was really focused on finding more low-carbon concrete, steel, aluminium, and copper solutions. And we did that in partnership with Bouygues, the French infrastructure company and telecoms company. And then we also pulled in Capgemini, and then we had Elemental Impact partner with us in terms of running the overall program. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to, one, find more low-carbon material solutions, but two, help them get access to more capital and more deployment opportunities. And so really the program was designed to provide that access to investment, but then also provide the winners with the ability to actually deploy their material in some of our operations. And so we were pretty much overwhelmed, actually. We had like 80 applicants, about 35 met the criteria. We had 9 pitch to our operationally focused teams across all 3 companies. And so we had our data center kind of materials innovation leads there, some of the procurement leads there as well. And the same for Capgemini and Bouygues, and that was amazing. The 9 finalists we're still working with today. There's a few pilot concrete pours happening. There's a few investment discussions underway, and we're going to be talking about them together next month with Capgemini and Bouygues as well. But those type of partnerships have helped us to not only find more solutions, but to promote those solutions to the market. We're seeing some incredible innovations there in terms of like things that would blow your mind around, applying generative AI, for example, on the concrete mix itself, and to apply millions of different, mix candidates to find the best one optimized for that country in those weather conditions for that temperature, and really reducing carbon. But even more so then finding those really interesting kind of steel, and we found a few wood solutions as well, engineered wood solutions. I think those types of partnerships have been really exciting for us and proven to drive some really significant outcomes that support our operations as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Look, for us, the partnership and the opportunity, and really the sort of, to say it again, the privilege of having the chance to work with your organisations for us at Macquarie is humbling, but it's also a real treat and a real opportunity. This has been a real treat and a great opportunity for us as well. So please, can everyone give a round of applause to Arina and James? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry, for great moderation.